Before the world was ruled by glass screens, it was built on a simple, physical click. This is the quiet story of the Blackberry, a journey that began in the snow of a small Canadian town, changed the way we connect, and eventually faded into the silence of history. Close your eyes and let's travel back to the beginning. The winter in this part of the world was not a disruption, but a blanket. In the university town of Waterloo, the snow did not fall with urgency. It descended in slow, deliberate sheets, thickening the air and muting the sounds of the streets below. It was a place defined by its quiet industry, a landscape of red brick buildings and gray skies, where the horizon often disappeared into a pale, white fog. Here, time seemed to move at a different pace than in the frenetic cities to the south. There were no skyscrapers scraping the clouds, no cacophony of constant traffic. Instead, there was the rhythmic crunch of boots on salted pavement and the soft hiss of tires rolling over wet asphalt. It was a town of deep thought, where the long, dark evenings encouraged people to turn inward, to sit by windows, and to work on problems that required patience. In the middle of this snowy expanse, nestled above a small shop that sold bagels and coffee, there was a room that hummed with a different kind of energy. To the passers-by on the street, the window on the second floor was just another square of yellow light against the dark facade, perhaps a student studying late or an artist finishing a canvas. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and heated rosin. The room was cramped, filled to the brim with the detritus of invention. Tables were not set for dinner, but were buried under tangles of copper wire, stacks of green circuit boards, and the bulky beige casings of early computers. Oscilloscopes sat like watchful sentinels, their small screens displaying dancing green lines that measured the heartbeat of electricity. In the center of this organized chaos sat a young engineer. He was a man of quiet intensity, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to be looking at something just beyond the visible spectrum. He did not move with haste. His movements were precise, almost surgical. He held a soldering iron like a pen, leaning in close to the board in front of him, watching as the silver alloy melted and flowed, joining two tiny points of metal in a permanent bond. He was obsessed with the invisible. While others walked through the town feeling only the cold wind, he felt the air thick with potential. He knew that all around them, unseen waves were traveling. Radio frequencies, broadcasts, signals bouncing from towers to receivers. To him, the air was not empty space. It was a highway that had not yet been paved. He had grown up fascinated by the way a voice could travel without a wire. As a boy, he had built radios, turning dials until the static cleared and a song or a sentence emerged from the white noise. That moment of clarity, where the signal cut through the interference, was the feeling he chased. It was a feeling of order emerging from chaos. Now, as a young man, that fascination had matured into a vision. He believed that data, words, numbers, information could eventually be untethered from the walls. In this era, computers were heavy, stationary anchors. They sat on desks, plugged into heavy sockets, drinking power from the grid and sipping data through thick, shielded cables. To move the computer was to break the connection. The young engineer imagined a world where the connection was fluid, where the machine could move as freely as the person using it. But that future was still far away, hidden behind a veil of technical hurdles and physics. For now, there was only the work. He was not alone in the room above the bagel shop. Beside him, often working at a neighboring bench or managing the few logistics their small operation required, was his childhood friend. Where the engineer was intense and internal, the friend was steady and affable, a grounding presence in the small, cluttered space. They had known each other since they were boys, bonded by a shared love of technology, in a time when technology was still a fringe interest. They communicated in a shorthand of nods and half-finished sentences, the comfortable silence of two people who understood the rhythm of each other's minds. The days in the workshop bled into nights. The sun would set early in the winter afternoon, casting long blue shadows across the floor, but the work continued under the hum of fluorescent lights. They existed on the periphery of the business world, taking on small contracts, fixing things, building displays, tinkering with the edges of what was possible. One of their early projects involved a system for displaying information on television screens. It was a modest beginning, simple white text floating on a dark background, but it required a mastery of how signals were sent and received. They called the system Budgie, a playful name for a serious piece of engineering. It was not a glamorous device. It was a box of wires and logic gates designed to sit in a corner and do its job without complaint. The young engineer treated every circuit board as if it were a cathedral. It was not enough for the machine to work. It had to be beautiful on the inside. He believed that the layout of the components, the cleanliness of the solder joints, and the efficiency of the pathways mattered. Even if no one else ever saw the inside of the casing, he knew. He believed that quality was a form of integrity. If the electricity could flow without resistance, if the heat could dissipate naturally, the machine would last. It would be reliable. Reliability was his currency. In a world where early computers often froze or failed, he wanted to build things that were as constant as the laws of physics themselves. Below them, the bagel shop opened in the early hours of the morning. The smell of baking dough and roasting coffee would drift up through the floorboards, mixing with the metallic tang of the workshop. It was a sensory reminder of the physical world, of warmth and sustenance, grounding them while their minds drifted in the abstract realms of code and frequency. They had little money in those early years. The furniture was secondhand, the chairs creaked, and the heating in the old building was temperamental. They wore thick sweaters indoors, their breath sometimes visible in the damp air before the radiators clanked to life. But there was a freedom in their poverty. They had no board of directors to answer to, no quarterly targets to meet. They had only their curiosity and the trust of the few clients who saw the spark of brilliance in their work. Occasionally, a contract would come in, a request from a local industry or a large automotive company needing a specific solution for their assembly lines. These moments were celebrated quietly. A contract meant rent for another few months. It meant they could buy better components, better testing equipment. They would drive their old cars through the snow to meetings, wearing suits that didn't quite fit, carrying their prototypes in cardboard boxes. The automotive contract was a turning point, though it didn't feel like a revolution at the time. It was simply a problem to be solved. A giant factory needed a way to display messages, to track the flow of materials. The young engineer and his friend built a network of displays, a nervous system for the factory floor. Watching the lights blink in sequence, seeing the data flow from one end of a massive warehouse to the other, the engineer felt a deep satisfaction. He saw that information was like water. It wanted to flow. His job was to build the pipes. But his mind always returned to the air. The wires that snaked across the floor of the factory were a limitation. They were tripwires, tethers, constraints. He looked out the window at the falling snow, watching the flakes drift freely on the wind. He imagined a packet of data moving like a snowflake, drifting silently from a transmitter to a handheld device, untethered and weightless. The technology to achieve this was primitive. Wireless data in those days was a rough, jagged thing. It was slow, prone to errors, and required immense amounts of power. Batteries were heavy bricks that died quickly. To send a simple sentence through the air required a device the size of a suitcase. Most people looked at these limitations and saw a dead end. They believed that wireless communication would always be reserved for voice, for the analog wave of a radio or a telephone call. Data, they argued, was too fragile. It needed the protection of a copper wire. The young engineer disagreed. He did not see the limitations as walls, but as variables in an equation that had not yet been solved. He spent hours studying the properties of radio waves, how they bounced off buildings, how they were absorbed by trees, how they weakened over distance. He approached the problem not as a businessman, but as a physicist. He wanted to understand the fundamental nature of the wave. He began to experiment with a standard known as Mobitex. It was an obscure, clunky network used mostly by emergency services and trucking fleets in Europe. It was not designed for the masses. It was a utilitarian system, rugged and slow, like a dirt road compared to a highway. But the engineer saw its potential. It was efficient. It broke data down into tiny packets, sending them only when the air was clear. It was a system designed for reliability, not speed. And reliability was what he loved. He imagined a device that could speak this language, a device small enough to hold, but smart enough to listen to the air, waiting for its specific pattern of signals. The nights grew longer as winter deepened. The town of Waterloo settled into a hibernation rhythm, the streets emptying early. But in the room above the shop, the lights stayed on. The engineer would sit in the stillness, a half-assembled prototype in his hands. He would run his thumb over the components, feeling the texture of the silicon and the plastic. He was trying to condense the world. He was trying to shrink the giant beige boxes of the computing world into something that felt human. There was no grand announcement of what they were doing. No press conferences, no magazine covers. There were just two friends and a small team of hired students working in a drafty room, fueled by cheap coffee and the stubborn belief that they could build something better than the giants of the industry. They called their company by a name that sounded industrial and precise, a name that evoked motion and intellect. But to the locals, they were just the quiet guys upstairs. One evening, a heavy snowstorm blanketed the region. The power flickered, and the hum of the equipment died for a moment before the backup systems kicked in. In the sudden silence, the engineer looked up from his work. He looked at his friend, who was reviewing a ledger by the light of a desk lamp. "It's about the bandwidth," the engineer said softly, as if continuing conversation that had been paused for hours. "We have to use the silence between the noise." His friend looked up and nodded, accustomed to these non sequiturs. "Efficiency," he replied. "Do more with less." "Exactly," the engineer said. "We don't need a wide road, we just need a clear path." He turned back to his soldering iron, the tip glowing hot orange in the dim light. He carefully touched it to the board, a wisp of gray smoke rising and curling into the air, disappearing like a signal into the night. The work was slow. It was repetitive, it was often frustrating. But it was never boring to them. They were building the foundation of a castle that no one else could see yet. They were laying the bricks, one by one, in the cold Canadian winter. As the months turned into years, the room above the bagel shop began to feel too small. The piles of equipment grew higher. More students were hired from the university down the road, bright young minds eager to work on the edge of the impossible. The company was growing, cell by cell, like a living organism. But the spirit of the place remained the same. It was a spirit of quiet determination, of sanding down the rough edges until everything fit perfectly. It was a belief that if you understood the physics, if you respected the laws of nature, you could make magic happen. The engineer finished his solder joint. He inspected it under a magnifying glass. It was smooth, shiny, and conical, a perfect connection. He set the board down and leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind howl against the window pane. The world outside was cold and disconnected, vast distances separating people and their warm homes. But in his mind, he could already see the invisible threads weaving them together, a tapestry of signals that would one day wrap the globe. He closed his eyes for a moment, resting them from the strain of the magnifying glass, and listened to the silence. It was the silence before a transmission, the static before the clear voice. He took a breath, opened his eyes, and picked up the next component. The night was still young, and there was so much left to build. The snow continued to fall, burying the town in white, while upstairs, the red LED of a test unit began to blink, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the darkness. Chapter 2. The Red Light Blinking. The seasons turned, as they always do, melting the heavy snows of the Canadian winter into the damp green of spring and finally into the hazy heat of summer. But the passage of time was not just measured in weather, it was measured in the gradual, quiet arrival of a new object in the world. It did not arrive with a fanfare. It did not appear on billboards or in television commercials interrupting the evening news. Instead, it appeared on the belts of serious people. It was a dense, rectangular object, encased in a hard, black plastic that felt cool and substantial to the touch. It was not a phone, nor was it simply a pager. It was something in between, a bridge across the silence. This device was built for utility, not beauty. It had the rugged, unapologetic aesthetic of a tool found in a hardware store. It was thick, heavy enough to pull slightly at the fabric of a waistband, a constant, grounding weight. It lived in a plastic holster, a rigid shell that clipped onto a belt with a strength that suggested permanence. There was a specific sound associated with it, a sound that would soon become part of the background audio of the working world. It was a sharp, distinct click, the sound of the device being slid back into its holster, locking into place. It was the sound of a task completed, a message sent, a responsibility returned to the hip. The face of the device was small, a monochrome square of gray-green glass that could display only a few lines of text at a time. The letters were blocky and pixelated, black squares floating in the liquid crystal soup. Below the screen was a keyboard, but it was unlike anything the world had seen on a typewriter. The keys were tiny, made of hard rubber, shaped like small, oval pebbles. They were crowded together, demanding a new kind of dexterity. To use it, one had to stop walking. It was a deliberate act. You would unclip the device, hold it in both hands, and use your thumbs to find the letters. It was a slow, tactile dance. Click, click, click. The keys had a resistance to them. They required intent. You could not type absent-mindedly. Every letter was a choice. But the true magic of the device was not in the plastic or the keys. It was in the light. In the upper right corner of the casing, there was a small LED. For most of the day, it lay dormant, a dark, unnoticeable speck. But when a message arrived, it came to life. It was a deep, rich crimson, a red light that pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Blink, silence, blink, silence. It was a heartbeat. It was a signal that somewhere across the city or across the country, someone was thinking of you. Someone needed you. In a world that was still largely unconnected, where stepping out of the office meant stepping into a void of silence, this red light was a tether. The device found its first home not in the hands of teenagers or socialites, but in the pockets of those who managed the flow of the physical world. Imagine a vast warehouse on the outskirts of a city, a cathedral of corrugated metal and dust. The air inside is still and dry, smelling of cardboard and packing tape. Rows of shelving stretch up into the darkness of the rafters, stacked high with pallets of goods waiting to be moved. In the past, this was a place of shouting, of loudspeakers crackling with distorted names, of paper lists carried on clipboards that were easily lost or stained with coffee. But now the warehouse manager walked the concrete aisles in silence. The device on his hip would vibrate, a short, dull buzz against his side. He would pause, the only sound the distant hum of a forklift. He would slide the black brick from its holster. The screen would glow with a pale, inductive light, easy to read in the dim aisles. Truck 4 at Bay 2, manifest confirmed. He would read the words, his thumb hovering over the keys. In the old world, he would have had to find a phone, dial a number, wait for an answer, and speak the confirmation. Now he simply typed, "Received." He pressed the wheel on the side of the device to send. The screen would display a small icon, an arrow moving outward. And then, the confirmation. Sent. The message traveled invisibly through the air, passing through the metal roof of the warehouse, bouncing across the dedicated radio network that the engineer in Waterloo had studied so meticulously. It was slow data, moving at the speed of a whisper, but it was robust. It did not need a strong signal. It could find its way through the interference of machinery and thick concrete walls. The manager would slide the device back into its holster, click, and continue his walk. The warehouse remained quiet, but the information was flowing. It felt like a secret power, a way to speak without opening one's mouth. This sensation of silent competence extended to other realms. In the sterile white corridors of hospitals, the device began to replace the blaring overhead pages that disturbed the rest of patients. The atmosphere here was different. The air smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. The lights were bright and fluorescent, humming with a frequency that tired the eyes. Doctors and nurses moved with swift, soft steps, their shoes squeaking faintly on the polished linoleum. For a doctor on call, the world outside the hospital used to vanish. But the device brought a new kind of peace. It sat on the belt of a white coat, a heavy reassurance. When it buzzed, it was discreet. A glance at the screen during a quiet moment at a nurse's station could reveal a lab result, a consultation request, or a simple question from a colleague on another floor. The red light blinking on a doctor's belt became a symbol of vigilance. It meant the line was open. It meant that even in the cafeteria, or in the elevator, or in the brief respite of a call room, they were connected to the pulse of the hospital. The typing was still a novelty. To see a surgeon with hands steady enough to suture a vein standing in a hallway using 2 thumbs to peck out a reply on tiny rubber keys was a strange sight. It looked awkward at first, a large person hunched over a tiny machine, but the utility was undeniable. Patient stable, coming down. 4 words, no wasted breath. The efficiency of it was addictive. It stripped communication down to its bones. There was no room for pleasantries or small talk on a screen that could only hold a few lines. The medium dictated the message. Communication became direct, factual, and essential. The network that carried these messages was known for its stubborn reliability. It was not fast, but it was relentless. If a user went into a subway tunnel where the signal died, the device did not panic. It simply held the message, waiting in its memory. The moment the train emerged into the daylight, the moment the invisible waves could touch the antenna again, the message would fly. This reliability created a deep, emotional bond between the user and the machine. It was trust. You did not have to worry if the message was sent. You knew. The device would tell you. The little letter D for delivered, and then, in a moment of quiet satisfaction, the letter R for read. Knowing that someone had read your words, miles away, without a word being spoken, felt like telepathy. As evening fell over the cities where these devices lived, the nature of the red light changed. In the bustle of the day, it was a notification. But at night, in the quiet of a home, it became a presence. A businessman returning from a trip might place the device on the bedside table of a hotel room. The room would be unfamiliar. The sheets stiff, the air conditioning unit humming a monotonous tune. The city outside the window was a landscape of strangers' lights. He would turn off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and there, on the nightstand, the light would pulse. Blink. It was a reminder that the office was still there, that the work continued. For some, this was a burden, a leash that could never be untied. But for many in those early days, it was a comfort, it was an anchor in the storm of modern life. It meant they were important. It meant they were needed. They would drift off to sleep, watching that slow, rhythmic red pulse, a lighthouse on the shore of their consciousness. The engineer back in Waterloo had designed the notification light to be efficient, to use as little battery as possible. He had not designed it to be emotional. Yet, for the thousands of people who now carried the device, it had become an emotional object. It was the first thing they reached for in the morning, before the coffee, before the shower. They needed to see what had arrived in the night. The device itself was durable, built to survive the rigors of the physical world. If it fell onto the pavement, it did not shatter, it bounced. The plastic was thick, textured to hide scratches. It was honest engineering. It did not pretend to be jewelry. It was a machine for processing words. In the boardrooms of the financial districts, the sound of the typing began to replace the scratching of pens. It was a soft, muffled thwack, thwack, thwack of thumbs on rubber. Meetings were punctuated by the silence of people reading, their heads bowed in a posture of reverence toward their hands. The Inter-at-Cutif pager, as it was formerly known, was establishing a new etiquette. It was acceptable to look away, to check the hip, to respond to the phantom vibration. The flow of information was becoming as important as the flow of conversation. And through it all, the red light kept blinking. It blinked in the pockets of coats hanging in cloakrooms. It blinked on the dashboards of cars stuck in traffic. It blinked on the tables of dimly lit restaurants. It was the heartbeat of a new organism, a network composed not of wires and nodes, but of people and their thumbs. The world was beginning to shrink. The distances between thoughts and actions were collapsing. The young engineer and his friend watched this from afar, from their snowy outpost. They saw the numbers rising, the volume of messages, the number of subscribers. They saw their vision of packets in the air becoming a reality. But they remained focused on the machine itself. They wanted to make it better. They wanted to make the keyboard more comfortable, the screen sharper, the battery longer lasting. They knew that this chunky plastic brick was just the beginning. It was the rough draft of a future they were writing one line of code at a time. As the chapter of the pager began to close, the world was no longer quite as lonely as it had been. A silence had been filled. The red light pulsed in the darkness, a steady, reassuring signal that said, "You are connected. You are here. We are listening." And in the quiet of the night, the users of the device slept soundly, tethered to the world by a thin, invisible thread of radio waves, waiting for the morning and the next message to arrive. Chapter 3, The Thumb and the Key. The shape of the world was changing, not in the shifting of continents or the rising of tides, but in the small, intimate geometry of the human hand. For generations, the hand had been a tool of grip and gesture. The fingers were the primary actors, pointing, grasping, and writing, while the thumb played a supporting role, a silent stabilizer against the palm. But as the years drifted forward, a new evolution began to take hold. It started in the design laboratories of Waterloo, where the engineers were no longer content with the simple, utilitarian brick of the two-way pager. They sought a form that felt less like a piece of industrial equipment and more like an extension of the body. They were sculpting a new relationship between the mind and the machine. The device grew taller, slimming down from the chunky square of its predecessor into a form that flared gently at the top and narrowed at the bottom. It was designed to rest in the cradle of the palm, balanced and weighted with a specific density that felt significant. It was not light like a toy. It had the density of a stone found in a riverbed, smooth and cool. But the defining feature, the landscape that would alter the posture of millions, was the keyboard. The engineers had obsessed over this small terrain. They understood that to shrink a typewriter onto a surface no wider than a credit card was a problem of physics and ergonomics. If the keys were flat, the thumbs would stumble. If they were too soft, there would be no certainty. So they looked to the world of music. They looked to the fretboard of a guitar, where raised ridges allowed fingers to find their place without looking. They sculpted the keys of the new device with subtle architectural precision. Each key was not merely a button, it was a tiny, asymmetrical slope cut at an angle to catch the edge of the thumb. They were hard, polished plastic, distinct from one another, separated by hairline fractures of space. When the thumb pressed down, there was a tactile event. It was not a mushy surrender, but a crisp, mechanical click. It was a sound and a feeling, a confirmation. Click. The letter was captured. Click. The thought was recorded. The sensation, the rhythmic click, click, click of the thumbs dancing over the plastic ridges, became a new kind of cadence in the world. It was a sound that began to fill the quiet spaces of modern life. Imagine a commuter train rattling through the gray dawn of a Tuesday morning. The windows are fogged with the collective breath of the passengers. Outside, the rain streaks horizontal lines across the glass, blurring the passing houses and trees into a watercolor wash. Inside the carriage, the air is warm and sleepy. In the past, this was a time for newspapers. The carriage would be a sea of broadsheet paper, the rustle of turning pages, the dominant sound. But now, the papers were folding away. In the hands of the commuters, the new devices glowed. The posture of the passengers had shifted. Shoulders were hunched slightly forward, heads bowed in a pose that resembled prayer. The device was held with both hands, cradled protectively, and the thumbs moved. They moved with a speed and dexterity that seemed impossible to an observer from a previous era. They flew across the tiny keyboard, finding the letters by feel, by muscle memory. The users did not need to hunt for the keys. Their hands had learned the map. The sound in the carriage was a soft, insectile chatter. 100 tiny mechanisms clicking in unison, a chorus of productivity. Click, click, click. Silence. Click, click. For the person holding the device, the experience was one of profound absorption. The screen was no longer the small green slit of the pager. It was larger, a monochrome window that glowed with a pale, bluish-white luminescence. It was crisp and high contrast, capable of displaying lists, paragraphs, and entire conversations. To navigate this window, there was a wheel. On the side of the device, perfectly positioned for the right thumb, sat a small, serrated track wheel. It rolled with a satisfying notched resistance. Ratchet, ratchet, ratchet. With this wheel, the user could scroll. They could descend through the layers of their digital life. They could roll through a list of emails that stretched back days, weeks, or months. It was an infinite scroll, a bottomless well of information. To select something, they simply pressed the wheel in, a solid, affirmative thunk. This interaction, scroll, click, type, became a loop that felt almost meditative. It was a fidget spinner for the executive mind. There was a soothing quality to clearing the inbox, to rolling the wheel and watching the messages disappear or file away. It gave the user a sense of control. The chaos of the office, the piles of paper, the ringing telephones, it was all compressed into this small, manageable object. The device was no longer just a way to receive alerts. It was a portable office. It was a way to carry one's professional identity in a pocket. The psychological shift was subtle but absolute. The boundary between the desk and the world dissolved. In the past, leaving the office meant severing the connection. You walked out the door, and the work stayed behind, trapped in the filing cabinets and the desktop computer. Now the work was liquid. It flowed into the elevator, into the taxi, into the departure lounge of the airport. It sat on the table during lunch. It rested on the console of the car. This constant connection was not experienced as a burden, at least not in the beginning. It was experienced as a superpower. It was a liberation. You could leave the desk and still be present. You could attend a child's soccer game and, with a few surreptitious clicks under the shade of a jacket, steer a merger in a distant city. You could be in two places at once. The device became a talisman. People began to customize them not with stickers, but with settings. They chose their ringtones, distinct chirps and trills that would cut through the noise of a restaurant. They bought leather cases, holsters with magnetic clasps that offered a satisfying snap when the device was sheathed. The wear on the devices told the story of their use. The back plates would become polished by the friction of palms. The track wheels would loosen slightly, becoming effortless to spin. The keys would shine where the thumb struck them most often, the space bar, the vowels, the enter key. As evening fell, the role of the device shifted again. In the quiet of a suburban home, after the dinner dishes were cleared and the house settled into the night, the device would often find its way to the sofa. The television might be playing in the background, a low murmur of news or drama, but the user's attention was divided. The blue glow of the screen illuminated the face in the dark living room. It was a cool, ghostly light. The user was physically present, sitting on the cushions, perhaps with a dog sleeping at their feet, but their mind was traveling the network. They were reading a memo from London, where the sun was already rising. They were replying to a colleague in Tokyo. There was a strange intimacy to this late-night communication. Emails sent at 11 p.m. had a different cadence than those sent at 11 a.m. They were often shorter, softer, stripped of corporate formality. The sent from my Blackberry signature at the bottom of the message became a universal code. It was an apology for brevity and a badge of dedication. It said, "I am here, I am listening, I am working even now." The bedroom became the final frontier. The device would travel up the stairs, carried like a precious stone. It would be placed on the nightstand, next to the alarm clock and the glass of water. The red light from the previous era was still there, blinking its slow, rhythmic pulse in the darkness. But now it was joined by the potential of the screen. Many users found themselves waking in the middle of the night, not from a noise, but from a phantom vibration, a sense that the device was calling to them. In the pitch black, they would reach out. Their hand would find the cool plastic. They would press a key, and the room would be bathed in that soft blue light. They would scroll, ratchet, just to check, just to see. It was a moment of solitude. The rest of the house was asleep, breathing deeply in the rhythm of dreams. But the user was awake, connected to the global nervous system. They would read a message, perhaps type a quick reply, click, 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 and then set the device down. The light would fade. The screen would go dark. And they would lay back, the blue afterimage lingering for a moment in their vision. It was a feeling of being tethered to something vast. The loneliness of the night was mitigated by the knowledge that the stream of data never stopped. It was a river that flowed around the clock, and they could dip their cup into it whenever they chose. The engineers in Waterloo had succeeded beyond their own comprehension. They had not just built a better radio, they had built a prosthetic for the modern mind. They had created a habit loop that felt as natural as breathing. The thumb, once a simple stabilizer, had become the primary antenna of the human will. The device was ubiquitous now. You saw it in the hands of presidents and prime ministers. You saw it in the hands of journalists reporting from the front lines. You saw it in the hands of mothers waiting in school pickup lines. It was a unifying object. If you saw someone else with that distinctive, flared shape in their hand, you knew something about them. You knew they understood the rhythm of the scroll. You knew they knew the feeling of the click. You were part of the same silent tribe. The world had sped up, yes, but the device made it feel manageable. It filtered the noise into a single column of text. It took the chaotic demands of the world and lined them up, one by one, waiting for the judgment of the thumb. Delete, reply, forward, save. The actions were simple, decisive, and satisfying. As the years of this era stretched on, the device became more than a tool. It became a companion. It was the last thing touched at night and the first thing touched in the morning. It was always there, a solid, reliable weight in the pocket or the purse. The engineers kept refining. They introduced color screens, though the colors were muted and professional at first. They improved the software, allowing for calendars and contacts to sync wirelessly, a feat of magic that happened invisibly in the air. But the soul of the machine remained the thumb and the key, that physical connection, that tactile bridge between the thought and the word was the anchor. It grounded the user in the physical world, even as their mind floated in the digital one. The click was the heartbeat of a generation. It was the sound of business being done, of plans being made, of lives being organized. It was a sound that implied competence. And so the world clicked on, safe in the assumption that this was the final form of communication. The glass slabs of the future were still just dreams in a distant laboratory. For now, the thumb was king, and the keyboard was its throne. The blue light glowed in the bedrooms of the world, a constellation of connected souls, drifting together through the long, quiet night of the early millennium. Chapter 4: The Anchor in the Storm. The sky was a piercing, impossible blue. It was the kind of morning that felt crisp and limitless, where the transition from summer to autumn hung in the air like a held breath. In the cities of the eastern seaboard, the sunlight reflected off the glass towers, creating sharp, bright angles of light that cut across the sidewalks. The world was moving at its usual rhythmic pace, a clockwork of trains and traffic, of coffee cups and morning meetings. The networks that bound this world together were invisible, but they were heavy with traffic. The cellular towers, standing like steel trees on rooftops and hillsides, were humming with the morning rush. Voices were traveling back and forth, thousands of conversations weaving through the air. Deals being closed, plans being made, casual greetings exchanged. It was a dense, woven fabric of analog sound converted into digital signals. Then the shadow passed over the world. It began not with a sound, but with a cessation of flow. In the chaotic moments that followed the event, the instinct of the city was to reach out. Millions of hands reached for phones. Millions of fingers dialed numbers. They called home, they called offices, they called emergency services. They sought the comfort of a human voice. But the architecture of voice is demanding. It requires a continuous, unbroken circuit. It requires a wide lane on the highway of the air. And on this morning, the highway was instantly gridlocked. The surge of calls was a tidal wave that crashed against the infrastructure. The towers, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the plea for connection, simply stopped. The dial tones were replaced by a fast, harsh, busy signal, or worse, by a hollow silence. Calls dropped. Circuits failed. The sophisticated voice networks, the pride of modern telecommunications, had fractured under the weight of human need. People stood on street corners, holding their phones to their ears, staring at the screens that read "network busy" or "no service." The invisible threads had snapped. But amidst this silence, in the pockets and on the belts of a few thousand people, a different kind of network was still breathing. The device from Waterloo operated on a different philosophy. It did not need a wide highway. It did not need to hold a continuous conversation. It dealt in packets, tiny fragmented shards of data. It was designed to look for the silence between the noise, to slip through the cracks of a congested world. While the voice networks collapsed, the data network, the old, rugged Mobitech system that the engineers had championed, remained standing. It was slower, yes. It was older. But it was built like a tank rather than a sports car. In the dust and the confusion of that Tuesday morning, a man stood in a crowded stairwell. The air was thick and hazy. The noise of the city outside was a muffled roar. But inside the building, there was a strange, focused quiet as people descended. He tried to use his cell phone, but the bars were gone. He felt the rising tide of isolation, the sudden, terrifying realization that he was cut off. Then he remembered the weight on his hip. He unclipped the device. The screen was gray, the backlight dim in the stairwell. He saw the signal indicator. It was weak, fluctuating, but it was there. The arrow was present. His hands shook slightly as he pressed the tiny keys. He did not type a memo. He did not check a spreadsheet. He typed 3 words. I am safe. He pressed the wheel. Click. The screen displayed the hourglass icon, the symbol of waiting. The device was listening to the air, searching for a handshake from the nearest tower. It was trying to push those few bytes of data through the chaotic atmosphere. A second passed, then another. The man watched the screen, his breath held in his chest. And then the icon changed. A check mark. Sent. A moment later, a small letter D appeared next to the message. Delivered. The relief that washed over him was physical. It was a release of tension that softened his shoulders and allowed him to breathe again. Somewhere, miles away, on another screen, those words had appeared. The connection had held. This scene played out thousands of times that day. In the canyons of the city, in the lobbies of buildings, on the ferries crossing the river, the black plastic bricks were working. They were sending messages of reassurance, coordinating logistics, connecting families when the voice lines were dead. In Washington, in the corridors of power where the decisions were being made, the device became the only reliable link to the outside world. Politicians and aides, usually surrounded by banks of secure telephones, found themselves huddled around the small monochrome screens, reading updates that trickled in one by one. The red lights were blinking in the Situation Room. Back in Waterloo, the atmosphere in the engineering offices was tense, but controlled. The team watched the server logs. They saw the spike in traffic, a vertical wall of data usage that far exceeded anything they had modeled. The servers were running hot. The fans were spinning at maximum speed. The engineers did not panic. They worked with the quiet precision of a submarine crew. They routed traffic. They balanced loads. They optimized the flow. They knew that what was passing through their system was no longer just business email. It was human reassurance. It was life and death. They saw the subject lines change, the trivialities of the corporate world. Meeting rescheduled. Q3 projections. Lunch vanished. They were replaced by urgent, elemental language. Where are you? Call me. I'm heading home. Love you. The engineers realized then that they had not just built a productivity tool, they had built a utility, they had built a lifeline. The gravity of their creation settled upon them. It was a heavy mantle to wear. The playful tinkering of the early days, the joy of sending text to a pager above a bagel shop, had evolved into a solemn responsibility. As the day turned into night and the initial shock began to settle into a bruised reality, the reliability of the device became a legend. Stories began to circulate. A CEO who coordinated his company's evacuation from a sidewalk. A government official who received critical orders while stuck in a bunker. A husband who let his wife know he had missed his train. The anchor metaphor took hold. When the storm came, when the waves were high and the winds tore the sails, the anchor held. The device was the thing that didn't move. In the weeks and months that followed, the perception of the device shifted fundamentally. It was no longer just a toy for the tech-savvy or a shackle for the workaholic. It was a security blanket. Corporations that had been hesitant to adopt the technology suddenly ordered thousands of units. Governments around the world issued mandates. Key personnel must carry one. The device became a standard piece of crisis infrastructure, as essential as a fire extinguisher or a backup generator. This shift was felt in the physical design as well. The device began to feel more serious. The playful colors of the pager era were gone completely, replaced by a uniform, matte black. It was the color of authority. The leather holsters became standard issue, worn on the belts of emergency responders, police officers, and high-ranking officials. The blue suits, the nickname for the corporate and government armies, embraced the device as their own. It fit their world. It was secure, encrypted, and reliable. It did not play games. It did not have a camera to distract or a music player to entertain. It did one thing, and it did it with absolute certainty. The engineers in Waterloo responded to this new reality by doubling down on security. They built walls around the data. They created encryption keys that were so complex they were virtually unbreakable. They routed the traffic through their own secure centers, ensuring that a message sent from a device in London to a device in New York never touched the open, vulnerable internet. This centralized control, which would later become a point of contention, was in these days seen as the ultimate feature. It was a private tunnel through the mountain. The winter returned to Waterloo, bringing with it the familiar snow and the long nights. But the mood in the offices had changed. There was a newfound seriousness. The company was no longer a scrappy underdog. It was a pillar of the establishment. The young engineer, now older and carrying the weight of a global network on his shoulders, would still walk through the server rooms. He would listen to the hum of the machines, the sound of millions of packets of data flying through the fiber optic cables. He knew that inside those machines were the secrets of governments and the whispers of families. He thought about the nature of trust. Trust was not something you could solder onto a circuit board. It was not a line of code. Trust was a history of showing up. It was the red light blinking when the power went out. It was the message saying delivered when the world was falling apart. The device had become an emotional object in a way that no one had predicted. It was a symbol of continuity. To have it on your belt was to know that you could reach and be reached, no matter what happened. The click of the keys sounded different now. It sounded like resilience. In the quiet moments of the narrative, we see the user pausing in their day, perhaps sitting on a park bench as the leaves fall around them. They pull the device from its holster, not because it buzzed, but just to check. They roll the track wheel. They see the bars of the signal strength. They see the date and the time. It is a small, grounding ritual, a verification of order. The storm had passed, but the world had changed. It was more fragile, more aware of its own vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, the sturdy plastic brick with its pebble keys offered a tangible piece of certainty. It was the anchor that had held, and the world would not forget it. The network continued to grow, spreading its invisible web across oceans and continents. The red lights blinked in unison across time zones, a global pulse of connection that defied the silence. The era of the always-on world had truly begun, forged not in the sunshine of convenience, but in the gray light of necessity. Chapter 5. The Blue Suits and the Holster. The geography of the story shifted now, expanding from the intimate, snow-dusted streets of the university town to a scale that was vast and architectural. In Waterloo, the small room above the bagel shop had long since been vacated, replaced by a sprawling campus of glass and steel. The buildings rose from the flat landscape like modern cathedrals of industry, their windows reflecting the gray Canadian sky and the orderly rows of trees that lined the boulevards. Inside these buildings, the silence was different. It was not the quiet of a few friends tinkering in the night. It was the hushed, air-conditioned hum of thousands. The engineers sat in endless rows of ergonomic chairs, their faces illuminated by the dual glow of monitors. They were an army of intellect, working in shifts to maintain the digital heartbeat that now circled the globe. The carpet swallowed the sound of footsteps, and the air smelled of filtered ventilation and fresh coffee. The company had become an empire, and like all empires, it had its own uniform, its own rituals, and its own distinct insignia. The insignia was worn on the hip. In the financial districts of the world, in London, New York, Hong Kong, and Frankfurt, a specific silhouette had emerged. It was the silhouette of the blue suit. These were the men and women who moved the capital of the world, who walked with purpose through the marble lobbies of skyscrapers, their heels clicking on the polished stone. And on their belts, almost without exception, sat the holster. It was a rigid plastic shell, often covered in leather, designed to hold the device with a grip that was both secure and accessible. It clipped onto the waistband or the belt with a strength that suggested it was not an accessory but a piece of equipment. It was the scabbard for the modern sword. There was a ritual to its use that became as unconscious as breathing. It began with the snap. The holster was equipped with a magnet, a small, hidden force that pulled the flap closed or held the device in place. When the device was sheathed, it made a distinctive, dull thud click. It was a sound of closure, a sound of security. When the device was drawn, it was a fluid motion. The hand would drop to the hip, the fingers would curl around the bottom edge of the black brick, and with a practiced tug, it would be free. The screen would light up automatically, sensing its release from the dark confinement of the holster. This motion, the draw, the check, the return, became the punctuation mark of the corporate conversation. You saw it in elevators as the doors closed. You saw it on street corners while waiting for the light to change. You saw it in the moments before a meeting began. A room full of people standing around a mahogany table, all with their heads bowed, thumbs working in unison. The device had changed the soundscape of the boardroom. In the past, meetings were defined by the rustling of paper and the clicking of pens. Now there was a new undercurrent. If you placed the device on the hardwood of a conference table, the vibration of an incoming message created a deep, resonant hum. ZZZZT. It was a sound that commanded attention without demanding it. And then the typing. In a room where a presentation was being given, you could hear the soft, insect-like chatter of the keyboards. Click, click, click. It was a background texture, a constant reminder that while the people were physically present, their minds were multi-threaded. They were listening, yes, but they were also managing crises in other time zones. They were efficient. Efficiency was the religion of this era. The device was not designed for leisure. It was designed to eliminate the friction of lost time. The interface was sparse and textual. It did not encourage aimless wandering. It presented a list of tasks, emails, calendar appointments, contacts, and asked the user to deal with them. Delete, reply, file. The Blue Suits loved it because it respected their time. It did not offer distractions. It did not offer games. It offered control. At the airports, the device was a badge of the frequent flyer. In the business lounges, amidst the smell of brewing espresso and the quiet murmur of news broadcasts, the travelers sat in leather armchairs. The device would be in their hand or resting on the small table beside a glass of water. The red light would blink, a message from headquarters, a change in the itinerary, a document to review. The user could scroll through a contract while waiting to board, the wheel turning with that satisfying ratchet. They could type a response while walking down the jet bridge, the thumbs moving by feel, the eyes scanning the path ahead. They were road warriors, untethered from the desk but never disconnected from the flow. The physical design of the device had evolved to match this status. It was no longer just rugged. It was refined. The plastic became smoother, the lines sharper. Chrome accents appeared, catching the light in the dim cabins of first-class flights. The screen became sharper, the text crisp and authoritative. But the core remained the same, the keyboard. It was the altar at which the business world worshipped. The keys were sculpted to cup the thumb, allowing for a typing speed that rivaled a desktop computer. People learned to type without looking. They could type under the table during a dinner. They could type while maintaining eye contact. It was a second language, spoken through the hands. The security of the system was another pillar of its dominance. The engineers in Waterloo had built a fortress. The data that flowed between the devices and the servers was wrapped in layers of encryption so dense that governments and intelligence agencies struggled to peer inside. For the banks and the law firms, this was non-negotiable. They were trading in secrets, mergers, acquisitions, legal strategies. They could not risk a leak. The device offered them a private tunnel through the chaotic public internet. When a message was sent, it disappeared into the secure tunnel and emerged only at the intended destination. It was a sealed loop. This feeling of exclusivity added to the allure. To have the device was to be part of a secure network. It was to be inside the walls. In the evenings, the ritual continued. The device would come home, still clipped to the belt or tucked into the breast pocket of a jacket. It was placed on the kitchen counter next to the car keys. It was a silent guest at the dinner table. The phantom buzz became a common psychological phenomenon. Users would feel a vibration against their leg, a ghost of a signal, only to check the device and find it still. The connection had become so integrated into the nervous system that the body anticipated it even when it wasn't there. Yet, in this era of dominance, the mood was not one of anxiety, but of mastery. The users felt they were the pilots of their own lives. The device gave them the power to pause the world, to curate the influx of information. They could choose when to engage. The vacation autoresponder became a relic of the past. Why disconnect when you could manage the flow from a beach chair? For many, the ability to check in just once in the morning, just once at night, allowed them to relax more, knowing that no fires were burning back at the office. The leash was long, but it was always there. Back in Waterloo, the campus continued to grow. The parking lots were filled with cars as far as the eye could see. The company was hiring the best and the brightest from around the world. They were building not just hardware, but a philosophy of work. They believed that the keyboard was eternal. They believed that the business world would always demand a physical, tactile response. They looked at the rise of touchscreens in other sectors, in kiosks or experimental gadgets, and dismissed them as imprecise. You couldn't run a corporation on a piece of glass. You needed the click. You needed the certainty. The executives sat in their corner offices, looking out over the empire they had built. They saw the numbers rising, millions of subscribers, billions in revenue. They saw the device on the belts of presidents. They saw it in the movies, held by the heroes who saved the day. It felt permanent. It felt like they had discovered the final form of mobile communication. They had optimized the human-machine interface to perfection. The seasons in Waterloo cycled through their familiar rhythm, the golden autumns, the deep white winters, the wet springs. And through it all, the servers hummed. The data centers were the beating hearts of the operation. Cool, dark rooms filled with blinking lights, processing the global stream of commerce. Every email sent was a tiny victory for the system. Every calendar invite accepted was a validation of the vision. The world was organized, encrypted, and delivered. The chapter closes on this image of stability. The blue suit, walking through a rainy evening in London, an umbrella in one hand, the device in the other. The red light pulses, a slow, steady heartbeat in the gray twilight. The user stops, scrolls, types a brief confirmation, and slides the device back into the holster. Snap. The sound is final. The world is in order. The anchor holds firm, and the ship sails on, powered by the invisible winds of data, secure in the belief that this is how it will always be. Chapter 6. The Glass Slab in the West. Thousands of miles away from the gray skies and brick factories of Waterloo, the light falls differently. In the valleys of California, the sun has a golden, persistent quality. It bathes the low, sprawling office parks in a warm haze, filtering through the leaves of eucalyptus and palm trees. It is a landscape that feels less like an industrial center and more like a campus, a place where the distinction between work and leisure is softened by the climate. In this western land, on a stage shrouded in darkness, a man walked into a single spotlight. He wore a uniform of his own, not a suit and tie, but a simple black shirt and denim. He spoke softly, with the cadence of a storyteller, holding the audience in a quiet trance. In his hand, he held the future, but to the eyes of the engineers watching from the north, it looked like an impossibility. It was a slab, a simple, smooth rectangle of black glass and metal. It had no chin, no antenna, and most strikingly, it had no keyboard. The landscape of the device was barren. The comforting ridges of plastic keys, the click, click, click of the track wheel, the physical geography that had defined the last decade of communication, all of it had been wiped away. In its place was a deep, black pool. When the man on the stage touched it, the pool lit up with a colorful, high-resolution glow. He did not press a button. He swiped his finger across the glass. The image on the screen moved with him, fluid and elastic, as if it were a physical object floating on water. He pinched his fingers together and the image shrank. He spread them apart and the image expanded. It was a kind of magic, a manipulation of light that felt closer to sorcery than engineering. News of this event traveled instantly across the continent, carried by the very networks that the engineers in Waterloo had helped to build. In the boardrooms and laboratories of the North, the broadcast was watched with a mixture of curiosity and clinical detachment. The atmosphere in Waterloo was not one of panic. It was too quiet for that. It was the atmosphere of experts observing a novelty. These were men and women who understood the physics of radio waves, the chemistry of batteries, and the limitations of bandwidth. They looked at the glass slab, and they did not see a threat. They saw a math problem that didn't add up. They gathered in small groups around monitors, analyzing the specifications. They spoke in the calm, measured tones of engineers. "It has no keyboard," one observed quietly. "How will anyone type?" To them, the keyboard was not just a feature, it was the anchor of utility. It was the mechanism that allowed thought to become text. They tried to imagine a serious person, a lawyer, a banker, a government official, trying to tap out a confidential memo on a flat piece of glass. There would be no feedback, no tactile confirmation, no click, just a blind tapping on a hard surface. It seemed clumsy. It seemed prone to error. They looked at the screen, so large and bright, consuming the entire face of the device. "The battery," another engineer pointed out gently. "It won't last until lunch." In their world, efficiency was king. A device had to last days, not hours. It had to sip power, not drink it. A screen that large was a floodlight. It would drain the power cell in a matter of hours, leaving the user stranded. And to make matters worse, the battery was sealed inside. You couldn't swap it out. You were tethered to a wall outlet, a regression to the days before true mobility. Then there was the network. The glass device was hungry. It was designed to browse the full, chaotic internet. Images, music, heavy websites. The engineers in Waterloo knew the cellular networks were fragile. They were narrow pipes. If thousands of people tried to pull rich data through those pipes at the same time, the network would clog. The calls would drop. The system would fail. They concluded, with the comforting logic of those who know how the world works, that the glass slab was a toy. It was a beautiful object, certainly. It was a marvel of industrial design. But it was not a tool. It was a media player, a device for watching videos and looking at photos. It was for the consumer, for the teenager, for the person who had time to wipe smudges off a screen. It was not for the blue suits. It was not for the people who ran the world. This belief was a warm blanket. It allowed the rhythm of work in Waterloo to continue uninterrupted. The snow fell outside the windows, piling up in soft drifts against the brickwork. The servers hummed their steady tune. The red lights on the belts of millions of people continued to blink, 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 confirming that the true work was still happening on their secure, efficient platform. The engineers went back to their desks. They were working on the next iteration of their own device. They were making the battery last even longer. They were refining the curve of the keys to be even more ergonomic. They were making the browser faster, but in a way that compressed the data. Respecting the limits of the network, they were being responsible. But out in the world, something subtle was shifting in the psychology of the user. The glass device arrived in the summer. It did not appear on the belts of executives at first. It appeared in the hands of the curious. People stood in long lines to hold it, to touch the glass. There was a sensory seduction to it. The interface was soft. It felt organic. When you reached the end of a list, the list didn't just stop. It bounced, like a rubber band. When you rotated the device, the screen spun with you, a liquid reorientation. It was playful. For years, technology had been hard, angular, and serious. It had been about efficiency. But this new object suggested that technology could be delightful. It could be a window into a world of color and motion. The blue suits began to look at these devices with a secret envy. They would finish their workday, holstering their trusty, secure communication tools. And then, perhaps in the privacy of their homes, they would pick up the glass slab. They would slide a finger across the screen to unlock it. They would look at photos of their children. They would browse the web not as a text-based list, but as a visual tapestry. A divide began to form. There was the device for work, the stern, black brick that demanded attention and replies. And there was the device for life, the glowing glass pane that offered music and maps and the internet in your pocket. In Waterloo, the leadership saw this divide and felt validated. See, they reasoned. We own the enterprise. We own the email. They own the play. They believed the two worlds would remain separate. They believed that no IT manager in a major bank would ever allow the glass device onto their secure network. It was too open, too risky. It didn't have the encryption tunnels. It didn't have the control. So the seasons turned again. The maples in Ontario turned a brilliant burning red before dropping their leaves to the wet pavement. The wind grew colder. The company in the north continued to grow. They were selling more devices than ever before. The numbers were up. The stock was high. The momentum of a decade of dominance is a heavy thing. It takes a long time to slow down. Even after the engine has been cut, They looked at the glass slab and saw its flaws clearly. They saw the cracked screens. They saw the people hunting for power outlets in airports, tethered to the wall while the users of the Waterloo device sat freely, their batteries still at 50%. They saw the clumsy typing, the autocorrect errors, the frustration of trying to write a long email on a flat surface. "It's a step backward," they whispered in the quiet corridors. "It's style over substance." But they missed the feeling. They missed the emotional shift that was happening in the fingertips of the world. People were willing to forgive the flaws for the feeling of the future. They were willing to charge their phones every night. They were willing to learn a new way to type. The glass slab was not just a phone, it was a computer. It was a platform. And slowly, software developers, the people who build the furniture of the digital world, began to move west. They began to build applications for the glass screen. Games, tools, news readers, weather maps. The screen was a blank canvas, and they were painting it with new possibilities. The device from Waterloo was a finished thought. It was perfect at what it did. But the glass device was an open question. It was becoming something new every day. The engineers in the north remained in their fortress of expertise. They were the masters of radio. They were the guardians of security. They had built the tracks that the world ran on. It was inconceivable that the world would suddenly decide to drive off-road. And so the winter settled in again. The snow covered the parking lots where the employees parked their cars. The heating systems kicked on, filling the offices with warmth. The meetings continued. The strategy remained the same. Build the best keyboard. Build the best battery. Secure the data. They did not see the glass slab as an existential threat. They saw it as a competitor in a different sport. They were playing chess. The company in the West was playing something else entirely. A game with colors and lights and gestures. The chapter ends in a quiet conference room in Waterloo. A prototype of the competitor's device sits on the table. It is black and silent. An executive reaches out and spins it. It rotates on the smooth mahogany surface, a sleek, sealed monolith. He watches it spin, the light catching the glass. He stops it with his hand. He pushes it slightly to the side, clearing the space in front of him. Then he reaches for his own device, the one with the familiar, clicking keys. He pulls it from his holster. He feels the weight of it, the balance. He begins to type a message to his team. Focus on the core. We know what our customers need. He presses send. The check mark appears. The red light blinks once, reassuringly. The room is quiet. Outside, the snow continues to fall, burying the landscape in white, flake by silent flake, as the world slowly, imperceptibly, begins to turn away. Chapter 7. The Storm. The air in the laboratories of Waterloo had always been cool and filtered, a controlled climate designed for the preservation of delicate electronics. But as the narrative moved forward, a different kind of pressure began to build within the walls. It was not a change in temperature, but a change in density. The atmosphere felt heavier, charged with a static electricity that had nothing to do with the winter storms outside. The world beyond the glass windows was shifting. The device from the west, the glowing slab of glass, was no longer a curiosity. It was multiplying. It was appearing in the hands of commuters, on the tables of cafes, and, increasingly, in the peripheral vision of the very people who had sworn loyalty to the keyboard. The leadership in the North, the men who had built the empire of the thumb, understood that a response was necessary. They could not simply ignore the allure of the screen. The public had tasted the forbidden fruit of a large, touchable display, and they liked the flavor. They liked the ability to touch a picture, to slide a map, to watch a video on a canvas that was not crowded by rows of plastic keys. But the engineers faced a philosophical dilemma. To them, typing on glass was a regression. It was numb. It was uncertain. There was no physical confirmation, no mechanical message sent back to the brain to say, yes, this letter has been chosen. It was like playing a piano painted on a table. The notes might sound, but the fingers felt nothing. So they embarked on a project of immense complexity. They decided to bridge the divide. They would build a device that looked like the future, a sleek, buttonless sheet of glass, but felt like the past. They would make the screen itself into a button. The concept was ambitious. They imagined a display that floated, suspended over a bed of microscopic sensors and springs. When the user pressed their thumb against the glass, the entire screen would depress. It would sink down a fraction of a millimeter, compressing a mechanical switch, and deliver a solid, audible click. They called this technology SurePress. It was an engineering marvel, a way to keep the tactile soul of the company alive in a body of glass. The development process was intense. The quiet, contemplative pace of the early years was replaced by a sense of urgency. In the testing rooms, the engineers worked with materials that fought against them. Glass is rigid. It does not want to bend. To make a piece of glass move, to make it float and bounce back instantly, required a suspension system of watch-like precision. They built prototypes that were heavy with magnets and coils. They tested the resistance. It had to be firm enough so that a casual brush would not register as a click, but soft enough that the thumb would not tire. It was a search for the Goldilocks zone of force. The sound was critical. It couldn't sound loose or rattly. It had to sound like a door closing on a luxury car, a solid thunk. As the months passed, the device began to take shape. It was heavier than its predecessors. It felt dense in the hand, a thick slab of technology packed with moving parts. It lacked the simple elegance of the solid-state bricks that had come before. When you shook it, you could almost feel the mass of the screen shifting on its suspension. The software team was racing to catch up with the hardware. They had to rewrite the logic of the interface. The operating system, which had been designed for the precise scrolling of a wheel, now had to understand the clumsy, imprecise prod of a finger. And here, the friction began to appear. In the late hours of the night, test units sat on the benches under the fluorescent lights. An engineer would swipe a finger across the screen. The glass would feel smooth, cool to the touch. But the image on the screen would hesitate. There was a lag, a tiny, imperceptible pause between the motion of the hand and the reaction of the machine. It was the feeling of walking through shallow water. There was resistance. The fluidity that the engineers in the West had mastered, that magical sense that the image was stuck to the finger, was missing. The software was heavy. It was trying to do too much. It was a complex engine trying to drive a new kind of vehicle. The click itself, the feature that was supposed to save them, became a source of dissonance. To type a letter, the user had to touch the glass to highlight the key, and then press down physically to confirm it. Touch, press, click. It required force. It required commitment. The rhythm was different. It was not the rapid-fire tick-tick-tick of the plastic keys. It was a slower, more deliberate thunk-thunk-thunk. Using the device felt like a physical activity. The thumb had to work harder. The screen had to travel down and pop back up before the next letter could be entered. There was a speed limit imposed by the physics of the suspension. If you typed too fast, the screen couldn't reset in time. The letters would run together. The flow was broken. But the momentum of the project was too great to stop. Contracts had been signed with major carriers. The marketing machine was warming up. The world was waiting for the Blackberry killer, the answer from the north. The launch came with the turning of the season. The device, named the Storm, was released into the wild. It was pushed into the hands of millions. The advertising was slick and confident, promising a revolution, a touch screen that clicked. For a moment, there was excitement. The loyal users, the blue suits and the teenagers alike, wanted to believe. They wanted the best of both worlds. They wanted the big screen and the click. But as the device settled into the daily lives of the populace, the atmosphere shifted from anticipation to confusion. Imagine a user sitting in a quiet room trying to write an email. They hold the device in both hands. They press the glass, clunk, the screen depresses, the letter appears. They press again, clunk, but the software freezes for a microsecond. The orientation sensor is confused. It spins the screen to landscape mode when the user wants portrait. The user waits. They press again, harder this time. The intimacy was gone. The relationship between the user and the device, which had been built on effortless trust, was suddenly filled with friction. The device was not disappearing into the background. It was demanding attention. It was acting out. The physical mechanism, so complex and clever, began to struggle with the chaos of the real world. Dust and lint found their way into the tiny gaps around the floating screen. The suspension springs tired. In some cases, the screen would stick in the down position, refusing to pop back up like a piano key that had lost its voice. The service centers began to fill. The boxes that arrived at the warehouses were not shipments of new stock, but returns. Pallets of them. Devices that had been used for a week and then put back in the box with a sigh of resignation. The engineers in Waterloo watched the data come in. They saw the return rates climbing, numbers that they had never seen before. In the past, a return was a rarity, an anomaly. Their devices were tanks. They didn't break. But this device was fragile. It was a complex machine trying to do something unnatural. The mood in the offices became somber. There was no shouting, no dramatic throwing of papers. Just a quiet, heavy realization that the bridge they had tried to build did not reach the other side. They had tried to compromise. They had tried to marry the old philosophy of tactile feedback with the new philosophy of the touch interface. But the marriage was unhappy. The result was a device that felt at war with itself. It wasn't quite a keyboard, and it wasn't quite a fluid screen. It was caught in the middle, in the uncanny valley of interface design. The young engineer, now a veteran of the industry, sat in his office with one of the units on his desk. He pressed the screen. Click. He released it. Click. He thought about the nature of tools. A hammer is simple. A wheel is simple. The original pager was simple. But this was an over-engineered solution to a psychological problem. They had been so afraid of losing the click that they had compromised the experience of the touch. The storm outside the window began to pick up, the wind rattling the glass of the high-rise building. It was a fitting backdrop. The company was entering a turbulent period. The aura of invincibility, the feeling that they could dictate the terms of how the world communicated, had been punctured. The trust of the user is a delicate thing. It is built over years of reliable service. The red light blinking in the dark, the messages delivered during the crisis. But it can be eroded quickly. People began to look at their devices with suspicion. They began to dread the lag, the freeze, the heaviness. The device was no longer an anchor, it was becoming a stone. And in the distance, the competitor from the west continued to glide. Their glass slabs were getting thinner, faster, lighter. They had abandoned the keyboard entirely and taught the world to type on glass without a click. They relied on software corrections, on visual feedback, on the adaptability of the human mind. They had trusted the user to change, while the engineers in Waterloo had tried to force the machine to stay the same. The chapter closes in a warehouse, late at night. The lights are dimmed, casting long shadows across the rows of shelving. On a pallet in the corner, a stack of returned devices sits in silence. They are boxed up, their screens dark, their suspension systems at rest. There is a sense of stillness here, a pause in the narrative. The experiment had failed. The attempt to hold back the tide of pure touch had resulted in a stumble. The red light on a nearby server rack blinks, steady, rhythmic, indifferent to the commercial fortunes of the hardware. The network was still strong. The data was still flowing, but the vessel that carried it was cracked. The engineers would go back to the drawing board. They would work harder. They would try to fix the software, to tighten the springs, to polish the glass. But the feeling in the air had changed. The winter felt a little colder, and the path forward, once so straight and clear, was now obscured by the fog of uncertainty. The storm had arrived, and it would not clear by morning. Chapter 8. The Divided Helm. High above the snowy streets of Waterloo and the upper reaches of the glass towers, the air was still. The atmosphere here was different from the bustling laboratories below, where soldering irons smoked and code scrolled across monitors. Here, in the executive suites, the air was conditioned to a perfect, sterile coolness. The carpets were thick, swallowing the sound of footsteps, and the walls were made of transparent glass, offering a panoramic view of the gray horizon. In this rarefied space, the leadership of the empire resided. It was a unique arrangement, a structure that had defined the company since its early days. There was not one captain at the helm, but two. For years, this duality had been their greatest strength. It was a partnership of perfect counterparts. On one side was the engineer, the quiet soul who understood the language of frequencies and the architecture of the circuit board. He was the grounding force, the one who ensured that the laws of physics were respected. On the other side was the strategist, the dynamic force who understood the language of the market, the art of the deal, and the psychology of the buyer. They had moved in lockstep, two hemispheres of a single brain. The engineer built the machine, and the strategist sold the dream. When the world was simple, when the goal was to put a pager on the belt of every professional, their visions were identical. They looked at the same mountain and climbed it together. But as the narrative of the world began to fracture, so too did the alignment in the high tower. The world outside was changing. The boundary between the office and the living room was dissolving. The device was no longer just a tool for the blue suits. It was becoming a window into culture. The glass slab from the West was teaching people that a phone should be a cinema, a jukebox, and a game console. In the quiet corridors of the executive floor, a subtle drift began. It was not a sudden break, but a slow tectonic separation. The engineer looked at the new world and saw inefficiency. He saw data-heavy applications that clogged the networks. He saw batteries that died before dinner. He saw operating systems that prioritized flashy animations over security. To him, the path forward was to double down on what they did best: perfection, reliability, security. He wanted to build a better tool for the serious person. He believed that eventually the world would tire of the toys and return to the machine that worked. The strategist, however, looked out the window and saw a different landscape. He saw the numbers. He saw the rising tide of consumers, the millions of teenagers and everyday people who wanted to be connected. He saw the apps, the games, the music. He understood that the device was becoming a fashion statement, a cultural object. He wanted to expand. He wanted to chase the new market, to open the gates and let the chaos in. They stood at a fork in the road, but the company could not split in two. It was a massive vessel, heavy with momentum, and it required a clear heading. The meetings and the glass-walled conference rooms became long and cyclical. They were not filled with shouting or anger. The tone was civil, professional, and heavy with intellect. But there was a fog of indecision that settled over the table. Minutes would turn into hours. Charts were presented. Spreadsheets were analyzed. The engineer would speak of bandwidth constraints and battery chemistry. The strategist would speak of market share and brand relevance. They were speaking two different languages, both correct in their own syntax, but incompatible in the same sentence. The result was a quiet paralysis. The clear, decisive orders that used to flow down to the floors below began to waver. The teams in the middle, the project managers, the designers, the software architects, waited for a signal. They stood in the hallways, holding their notebooks, looking for the North Star. But the compass needle was spinning. One week, the directive would be to focus on the enterprise, to lock down the security and serve the banks and governments. The next week, the wind would shift, and the order would be to build a music player, a consumer interface, something to dazzle the youth. The product became a reflection of this divided soul. The engineers were asked to build machines that were contradictions. They were asked to build a tank that drove like a sports car. They were asked to build a secure fortress that had open doors for everyone. In the silence of the executive suite, the two leaders would often retreat to their separate offices. They sat at their desks, surrounded by the awards and patents of the golden age. The distance between their doors was short, a matter of feet. But the philosophical distance was becoming an ocean. The engineer would sit with a prototype in his hands, running his thumb over the keys. He was looking for the flaw, the micron of imperfection. He was trying to solve a physics problem. He believed that if he could just make the radio efficient enough, if he could just make the code tight enough, the problem would go away. He was trying to engineer his way out of a cultural shift. The strategist would be on the phone, his voice low and urgent. He was trying to negotiate his way out. He was looking for partners, for carriers, for a grand alliance that would secure their position. He was trying to buy time. Outside, the seasons continued their relentless march. The autumn winds stripped the trees bare, and the first frosts of winter coated the glass of the tower in delicate, fern-like patterns. The view of the city became obscured by mist and snow. The atmosphere in the building grew heavy. It was the feeling of a ship that has lost its rudder in calm waters. The engines are still running, the propellers are turning, but the forward motion feels sluggish. There is a vibration in the hull, a sense of strain. The staff, loyal and hard-working, felt the weight of the silence from above. They worked harder, trying to compensate for the lack of direction with sheer effort. They stayed late, the lights of the office park glowing long into the night. They tried to build everything for everyone, hoping that something would stick. But a product built by committee, a product born of compromise, lacks a heartbeat. It lacks the singular, opinionated vision that defined the early days. In the hallways, the blue suits still walked with purpose, their holsters on their hips, but their conversations were changing. They spoke in hushed tones about the news from the West. They spoke about the new apps their children were using. They wondered quietly why their trusted device felt a little older, a little slower, a little less magical than it used to. The co-CEOs, the architects of the revolution, were caught in a trap of their own success. They had built a system so perfect for one era that it struggled to breathe in the next. They were like captains of a great sailing ship watching the age of steam arrive. They knew how to harness the wind, but the wind was dying. There were moments of attempt at reconciliation. Dinners were held, strategic retreats were organized. They would sit together, trying to recapture the synchronicity of the bagel shop days. They would nod and agree on broad themes. We must innovate. We must lead. But when they returned to the tower, to the specifics of the roadmap, the drift would return. The gravity of their respective worldviews was too strong. The engineer retreated further into the details, obsessing over the keyboard. The one thing he knew was superior. The strategist looked further outward, trying to acquire new companies, trying to buy innovation from the outside. The narrative here slows down to observe the stillness of a late evening in the executive wing. The office is empty, save for the cleaning staff moving silently with their carts. The lights are dimmed. The 2 office doors are closed. Through the glass walls, the lights of Waterloo twinkle in the darkness. The snow is falling again, silent and relentless. It covers the roads and the cars, softening the hard edges of the world. Inside the boardroom, the long mahogany table is empty. The chairs are pushed in. On the whiteboard, erased ghosts of diagrams and flowcharts remain, faint markers of a strategy that never quite solidified. The divided helm did not result in a crash. It resulted in a drift. The ship began to turn in a wide, slow circle. To the passengers, it might have felt like movement. But to the stars, it was stagnation. The red light on the server racks in the basement continued to blink. The messages continued to flow. The revenue continued to pour in, a lagging indicator of past glory. But the spark, the unified will that had once propelled a small Canadian startup to the center of the world, was flickering. The 2 captains remained at their posts, dedicated and brilliant, but they were steering different courses, and the ship, caught in the tension between them, drifted slowly into the long, cold winter of the waiting game. Chapter 9. The Exclusive Garden. While the winds of indecision blew through the high towers of the corporate headquarters and the engineers struggled to bridge the gap between the button and the glass, a different kind of phenomenon was taking root in the world below. It was growing in the cracks of the pavement, in the schoolyards, in the university lecture halls, and in the bustling streets of cities far from the Canadian snow. It was not a hardware revolution. It was not built on the sleekness of the casing or the resolution of the screen. It was built on a simple, invisible code. For years, the device had been a tool of the blue suits, a serious instrument for serious people. But as the older models trickled down, passed from parent to child, or bought secondhand in the markets of Jakarta, London, and Lagos, the nature of the network began to shift. The device found its way into the hands of a generation that did not care about stock prices or email security. They cared about each other. They discovered a feature that had been buried in the software, a tool that the engineers had originally designed as a practical utility for colleagues to chat without using SMS text messages. It was an instant messaging service, secure and immediate. But to access it, one needed a key. Every device that left the factory in Waterloo was stamped with a unique identity. It was not a phone number, which was public and tied to a SIM card. It was a hexadecimal string, a random arrangement of 8 numbers and letters. It was called the Personal Identification Number, or simply the PIN. This string of characters became a new form of social currency. In the past, you gave someone your phone number. It was a utilitarian exchange. But to give someone your PIN was an invitation. It was a digital handshake, a granting of access to a private room. The world began to divide into 2 distinct territories, those who were inside the garden and those who were looking over the wall. To be inside was to be part of a continuous rolling conversation. The messaging service, known simply by its 3-letter acronym, created a sense of presence that was addictive. Unlike the slow, turn-taking rhythm of email, this was rapid fire. It was a stream of consciousness. The interface was simple. A white background, a list of names, and the chat window. But the psychological power lay in the tiny letters that appeared next to each sent message. First, a checkmark. Sent. The message had left the phone. Then the letter D. Delivered. The message had arrived safely on the other person's device. And then the moment of truth. The letter R. Read. This small character changed the emotional landscape of communication. For the first time, you knew with absolute certainty that the other person had seen your words. You knew they were holding the device. You knew they were there. In the dormitories of universities and the bedrooms of teenagers, the R became a source of intense focus. It created a feeling of intimacy. If the R appeared and the typing indicator, a small icon showing that a response was being crafted, began to dance, there was a connection. Two minds were synchronized in real time, tethered by the invisible data network. If the R appeared and silence followed, it was a message in itself. A pause. A hesitation. The system conveyed not just text, but timing. This network became a walled garden. It was lush and vibrant inside. The messages were free, unlimited, bypassing the expensive per-text charges that telecom carriers levied on regular phones. This economic freedom allowed the conversation to flow like water. Where are you? Coming now. Did you see this? 1,000 tiny fragments of life exchanged every hour. But the garden had high walls. You could only talk to others who held the device from Waterloo. If your friend had the glass slab from the west or a flip phone from the north, they were outside. They were unreachable in this specific, intimate way. You had to send them a regular text, a clumsy green bubble relic that felt slow and expensive. This exclusivity created a fierce loyalty. It was a club. To belong, you had to have the hardware. You had to have the keyboard. In London, the device became a status symbol among the youth, but not in the way a luxury watch is a status symbol. It was a tool of the tribe. You saw groups of teenagers on the bus sitting in a circle, their heads bowed, thumbs flying in a blur of motion. They were physically together, but they were also digitally woven into a larger web of friends across the city. They weren't looking at the internet, they were looking at each other. The sound of the notification was distinct. It was not the standard ringtone. It was a sharp, high-pitched ping, or a specific double vibration. Buzz buzz. That sound triggered a Pavlovian response. In a classroom, if a bag vibrated against a chair leg, heads would turn. Someone was being summoned. Under the desks, hands would blindly find the device, thumbs locating the keys by touch alone, typing a reply without the eyes ever leaving the teacher's face. The keyboard, which the engineers had designed for the precise emails of lawyers, turned out to be the perfect instrument for this new, hyperspeed dialect. The youth invented a new language to fit the speed of their thumbs. Vowels were dropped. Sentences were compressed. Acronyms blossomed. The click-click-click of the keys was the drumbeat of a subculture. The blue suits and the high towers had viewed the pin as a security feature. The youth viewed it as a velvet rope. Pin me became a phrase of courtship, of friendship, of inclusion. It was written on napkins in cafes, it was whispered at parties. For a few golden years, this software phenomenon held the world in a strange suspension. The hardware was aging, the browser was slow. The apps were clunky compared to the smooth, colorful experiences offered by the glass slabs. But none of that mattered, because the glass slabs were lonely. They didn't have the garden, they didn't have the R. The narrative drifted into the evenings, where the glow of the screen replaced the television. In a quiet house, a teenager would lie on their bed, the room dark save for the cool blue luminescence of the display. The red light on the casing would blink, a rapid, urgent pulse. They were in a group chat, a chaotic, hilarious, sprawling conversation with 10 other people. Jokes flew back and forth. Plans were made for the weekend. Drama unfolded and resolved in the span of minutes. The feeling was one of being wrapped in a warm, digital blanket. You were never alone. As long as the battery held and the network stood, you were part of the group. This phenomenon spread globally. In places where the internet was still expensive or hard to access on a computer, the device became the primary window to the world. In Indonesia, in South Africa, in Mexico, the brand became synonymous with the internet itself. To have a Blackberry was to be connected. The engineers in Waterloo watched this from a distance. They saw the server loads spiking, not from corporate emails, but from this endless chatter. They were pleased, but perhaps also a little confused. They had built a cathedral for business, and the teenagers were using it for a party. They tried to nurture it. They released cheaper, colorful versions of the device, curved, approachable models in white, pink, and purple. They were acknowledging the guests in the garden. But the walls remained. The leadership believed that the exclusivity was the asset. They believed that if they opened the gates, if they let the software run on other devices, the magic would dissipate. They thought the hardware and the software were a single, indivisible soul. So the garden remained closed. It was a beautiful twilight era. It was the last moment before the great unification of the internet, before the cross-platform apps would arrive to tear down the walls. For now, there was a special pride in belonging. There was a tactile memory associated with this time. The feeling of the trackpad or the trackball under the thumb, scrolling through a long history of messages, the ability to go back and read a conversation from days ago, preserving the memory of a friendship, the way the device felt warm in the hand after an hour of intense typing. The users forgave the device its flaws. They forgave the browser that couldn't load a video. They forgave the camera that took grainy photos. They forgave the occasional need to pull the battery out to reset a frozen screen, a ritual known as the battery pull, which became a shared cultural experience, a moment of patience while the machine rebooted. They forgave it all because of the connection. In the quiet of the night, the red lights blinked in unison across the cities. From the high-rise apartments to the suburban bedrooms, the pulse was synchronized. It was a heartbeat of a specific frequency. The exclusive garden was at its peak bloom. It felt permanent to those inside it. They could not imagine a world where they didn't ask for a PIN. They could not imagine a world without the satisfying tactile confirmation of the keyboard. But outside the walls, the glass slabs were multiplying. The developers in the West were working on new ways to connect, ways that didn't require a specific brand of hardware. They were building bridges that would span the moat. The chapter rests on this image of the walled garden at dusk. It is a peaceful, busy place. The air is filled with the murmur of a million digital whispers. The inhabitants are happy, safe in their enclosure, typing away on their pebble keys. They are unaware that the walls are about to be breached, not by force, but by a simple, universal desire for the open road. The red light blinks. A message is received. A thumb moves to reply. Click. The connection holds, for now, in the sweet, exclusive silence of the garden. Chapter 10. The Long Winter of Delay. The decision to stop the machine was not made lightly. It happened in the deep quiet of the executive tower, a realization that had been growing like a slow fracture in a foundation. The code that had powered the empire for a decade, the lines of logic written in the room above the bagel shop, the scripts that managed the blinking red lights and the secure tunnels, was tired. It was an old engine, built for a smaller world. It had been patched and expanded, stretched and bolstered, but it could no longer carry the weight of the future. The glass slabs from the West were running on software that was fluid, modern, and built for the rich media of the new internet. The device from Waterloo was still thinking in text, in lists, and in compression. So the leadership made a choice that was both brave and perilous. They would not patch the old ship again, they would build a new one. They looked outside their walls and found a new heart. It was a piece of software legendary for its stability, a system used to run nuclear power plants, high-speed trains, and the dashboards of luxury cars. It was bulletproof. It was modern. It was everything the old system was not. They brought this new engine into the laboratories of Waterloo. The goal was simple but immense. Take this industrial-grade power and shrink it down to fit in a human hand. They would build a new operating system from scratch. It would be the perfect fusion of security and fluidity. It would be the savior. And so, the long winter of development began. In the physical world, the snow fell and melted, the grass turned green and then brown, and the leaves fell again. But inside the glass buildings, time seemed to stretch and distort. The atmosphere shifted from the rhythmic hum of production to the heavy, silent concentration of creation. It was a period of deep incubation. The engineers, the best in the world at what they did, retreated into their screens. They were laying the tracks for a new railroad, but they had to tear up the old ones first. The work was painstaking. To build an operating system is to build a universe. You have to define gravity. You have to define how light works. You have to decide what happens when a finger touches a surface, how a letter appears when a key is pressed, how the battery manages its energy when the device is asleep. Every single function that the users took for granted, the alarm clock, the calendar, the email client, had to be rewritten. Nothing could be carried over. It was a blank slate. The mood in the offices was one of perfectionism. The company had a reputation to uphold. They could not release a product that crashed. They could not release a product that was insecure. The blue suits demanded reliability. The garden demanded speed. It will be ready when it is ready, was the mantra. But the world outside was not waiting. While the engineers in Waterloo polished the brass of their new vessel, the fleet in the West was sailing at full speed. The glass slabs were being updated every year. They were getting thinner. Their screens were getting brighter. The app stores were filling with millions of colorful distractions. The habit of the touchscreen was setting into the muscle memory of the public. In Waterloo, the calendars on the walls became sources of silent tension. A launch date would be penciled in, a target in the spring. As the snow began to thaw, the date would be erased and moved to the summer. When the heat of July arrived, the date would drift to the autumn. The project was massive. It was a complexity trap. The engineers were trying to replicate 10 years of features in 2 years of work. They wanted to ensure that when the new device launched, it could do everything the old one could do, but better. They didn't want to leave anything behind. This desire for completeness created a heaviness. The list of requirements grew longer. The bug reports piled up. The progress bars on the screens moved with agonizing slowness. The silence of the delay began to echo. The marketing teams, ready with their campaigns, were told to stand down. The sales teams, fielding calls from impatient carriers, had nothing new to offer. They had to sell the old devices, the aging warriors of the previous generation, while promising that the future was just around the corner. "It is coming," they would say, "and it will be worth the wait." The users, the loyal tribe of the thumb, began to drift. They held their worn-out devices, the trackballs loose, the cases scratched. They waited. They watched their friends switch to the glass slabs. They watched the exclusive garden become a little quieter as people left for the open plains of other messaging apps. But the faithful held on. They believed in the promise. They believed that the company that had invented the smartphone would reinvent it. Inside the fortress, the days bled into nights. The engineers worked with a stoic determination. They were solving incredible problems. They were making the new system multitask in a way no phone ever had. They were building a hub, a central place where all messages, email, texts, social media would flow together in a beautiful, unified stream. It was a brilliant concept. It was a vision of efficiency that matched the soul of the company. But brilliance takes time, and time was the one resource they were running out of. The seasons in Waterloo are distinct. The winter is long and gray. The sky hangs low, a blanket of white cloud that diffuses the light. It is a season of endurance. During this long development phase, the company felt frozen in that winter. The revenue began to dip. The stock price began to slide. The news articles shifted from praise to skepticism. "Where is it?" the headlines asked. "Is it too late?" The leadership tried to keep the morale high. They held town hall meetings. They showed glimpses of the new software. It looked beautiful. It flowed like water. It had the security of a vault. The employees would leave these meetings feeling energized, believing again in the mission. Then they would return to their desks, and the reality of the code would settle back in. The glitches, the battery drains, the features that worked in the lab but failed in the field. There is a phenomenon in long projects where the finish line seems to recede the closer you get to it. You fix one problem and two more appear. The complexity of modern technology is a hydra. The narrative here is one of stasis. We see the empty lobbies of the manufacturing plants, waiting for the new molds. We see the retail stores, where the shelf space for the brand is shrinking, pushed to the side by the aggressive displays of the competitors. We feel the waiting. It is a heavy, blanketed feeling, like the air before a thunderstorm. The engineers were chasing a moving target. By the time they finished a feature that matched the competition had moved on to something else. They were running a race against a ghost. And yet, there was a quiet nobility in the effort. They refused to release a broken thing. They held to their standards. They believed the quality would win in the end. They believed that the business world would not tolerate the toys from the West forever. They believed that eventually the adults would want their tools back. So they kept working, they kept polishing, they kept testing. The blue suits, the loyal army that had sustained the company for so long, were also changing. The era of the IT department dictating the tool was ending. A new policy was sweeping through the corporate world. Bring your own device. The executives, the lawyers, and the bankers had grown used to their glass slabs at home. They liked the color, they liked the ease, they liked the apps. They didn't want to carry two phones anymore. They wanted to bring their personal life to work. And so the IT managers, once the gatekeepers who demanded the security of the Waterloo device, began to relent. They installed software on the glass slabs that mimicked the security of the old days. It wasn't quite as good, but it was good enough. The fortress walls had not been breached by force. They had been bypassed by convenience. In the weeks and months following the launch, a quiet phenomenon began to occur in the logistics chain. The factories in Mexico and Hungary were churning out the new devices, running the lines day and night, fulfilling the optimistic orders that had been placed. The trucks were loaded, the planes took off, but at the other end of the line, the flow stopped. The inventory began to accumulate. In the distribution centers, the pallets of black boxes were stacked higher and higher. They sat in the cool, dust-free air of the warehouses, rows upon rows of them. Millions of screens that would never light up, millions of batteries that would slowly lose their charge. It was a silent crisis. There were no explosions, no public disasters, just the stillness of objects that had no home to go to. Back in Waterloo, the data came in on the screens of the executives. They watched the sales figures. They looked for the hockey stick curve, the exponential growth that signals a hit. Instead, they saw a flat line, a plateau. The realization settled in slowly, like the dusk on a winter afternoon. It was not a realization of failure in the engineering sense. They knew they had built a good machine. It was a realization of irrelevance. The world had moved on. The conversation had shifted. The definition of what a phone was had changed fundamentally. It was no longer about communication efficiency. It was about consumption, entertainment, and ecosystem. The engineers who had spent the long winter pouring their souls into the code walked the hallways with a quiet resignation. They saw the reviews. Great hardware, the critics said. Too late, they added. It is a profound melancholy to build a cathedral in a land that has stopped praying. The marketing campaigns continued for a while, brave faces on billboards and television spots, trying to explain why the hub was better, why the keyboard still mattered. But they were shouting into a wind that was blowing the other way. The exclusive garden of the messaging service, once the crown jewel, was now open to everyone. In a last-ditch effort to stay relevant, the company had released the software to the rival platforms. You could now use the service on the glass slabs. But the magic had evaporated. The exclusivity was gone. And the world had already found new gardens, green bubbles, blue bubbles, other apps that worked across every device without friction. The walls were down, but the people were leaving, not entering. The chapter closes on the image of a retail store at the end of the day. The staff are cleaning the glass counters. The lights are being dimmed. On the display stand, the new device sits on its pedestal, tethered by a security cord. It is sleek, it is modern. The red light pulses softly, waiting for a notification that will not come. A janitor mops the floor, the swish of the wet mop the only sound in the empty space. He walks past the display without looking. The device is a ghost in the room, present, tangible, but no longer part of the living world. The launch had happened. The noise had been made. But the echo died out almost instantly, swallowed by the immense, noisy, colorful torrent of the new era. The silence that followed was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of an ending. Chapter 12. The Fade to Gray. The wind in Waterloo has a way of erasing things. It blows across the flat, open fields, carrying the snow in fine, shifting drifts that cover the roads, the sidewalks, and the tracks of those who have passed before. It is a patient force, one that smooths the edges of the world and returns everything, eventually, to a state of quiet uniformity. In the sprawling campus that had once been the beating heart of the global network, the atmosphere began to change. The frantic energy of the expansion years, the hum of the servers running at capacity, and the confident stride of the executives, all of it began to soften, like a sound fading into the distance. The dismantling of an empire is rarely a sudden event. It does not happen with a crash, but with a series of small, quiet removals. It is a process of subtraction. It began with the parking lots. For a decade, these vast stretches of asphalt had been a sea of vehicles, packed so tightly that finding a space was a daily victory. They were the staging grounds for an army of thousands arriving each morning to build the future. But slowly, the spaces began to open up. The sea receded. The asphalt prairies grew wider, revealing the gray lines of the painted stalls. The snow, once churned into slush by thousands of tires, now lay in pristine, undisturbed sheets. Then came the signs. On the sides of the glass buildings, the large, bold letters that had announced the company's name to the world were taken down. It was a slow, mechanical ballet. A crane would arrive on a Tuesday morning. Men in orange vests would ascend in a basket. There was no ceremony. They simply unbolted the steel and the plastic, disconnecting the wiring that had made the name glow blue in the night. One by one, The letters were lowered to the ground. The facade of the building was left with the faint outlines of where the words had been, a ghost of the brand etched into the stone by the sun and the rain. Then the trucks would drive away, leaving the building anonymous again. Inside, the spaces were being repurposed. The long hallways, once crowded with project managers and developers rushing to meetings, grew still. The cubicles were emptied. The artifacts of a working life, the framed patents, the stress balls, the tangled chargers, the photos of office parties, were packed into cardboard boxes. There is a specific sound to an office packing up. It is the sound of tape guns sealing boxes. Z, 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 IP, snap. It is the sound of drawers being slid open and checked one last time. It is the sound of footsteps echoing on carpet that is no longer dampened by the presence of a crowd. The employees left not with anger, but with a quiet acceptance of the season's turn. They walked out of the glass doors, carrying their boxes to their cars. They were the engineers who had built the tunnels of encryption. They were the designers who had sculpted the keys. They were the architects of the garden. They did not disappear. They dispersed. Like seeds carried by the wind, they floated out into the wider world. They went to the university down the road. They went to the new startups sprouting in the renovated brick warehouses of the town. They took their knowledge, their discipline, and their memories of the click with them, planting them in new soil. The buildings themselves did not stay empty for long. The infrastructure of the empire, the fiber optic cables, the reinforced server rooms, the high-tech laboratories remained. New tenants moved in. Younger companies, with strange names and different dreams, occupied the floors. They brought with them a new culture. They tore down the cubicle walls. They brought in beanbag chairs and espresso machines. They did not wear suits. They did not carry holsters. They carried the glass slabs from the west, tapping on them casually as they walked through the halls that had been built by the thumb. The legacy of the original company was now part of the foundation, unseen but structural. The town of Waterloo had changed because of it. It was no longer just a university town. It was a technology hub, a place where the air was still thick with the potential of invention. As the physical footprint shrank, the device itself began to fade from the visual landscape of the world. It became a rare sighting. In the airports, where it had once been the uniform of the traveler, it was now an anomaly. If you saw someone holding one, a device with a physical keyboard, it triggered a moment of nostalgia. It was like seeing a classic car on the highway. You recognized the silhouette. You remembered how it felt to drive it. The blue suits had moved on. They had surrendered to the glass. They had learned to type on the flat screens, accepting the autocorrect errors as the price of modernity. The holsters were unclipped from the belts and placed in drawers, joining the wired headphones and the old chargers in the graveyard of obsolete electronics. The phantom buzz that had haunted the legs of a generation finally stopped. The nervous system of the world retrained itself. The expectation of the red light, the constant, blinking demand for attention, was replaced by the chaotic, colorful notifications of the app era. The exclusive garden was no longer a walled city. It was just another app, lost in a folder on a screen filled with distractions. The pin, once a badge of honor, became a piece of trivia. And yet, in the quiet corners of the narrative, the memory remained. There were those who refused to let go. A small, dedicated rear guard kept their devices running. They bought replacement batteries online. They repaired the trackpads. They held on to the tactile sensation because it meant something to them. It meant focus. It meant privacy. It meant a time when technology was a tool, not a lifestyle. But even for them, the silence was growing. The servers that powered the network were being consolidated. The lights in the data centers were being turned off, rack by rack. The stream of data that had once been a torrent was now a trickle. We return, finally, to the snow in Waterloo. It is deep winter again. The sky is the color of slate. The wind howls between the buildings, kicking up swirls of white powder. The town is quiet, settled into the long, dark evening. The room above the bagel shop, where the story began so many chapters ago, is dark. The shop below is still there, the smell of baking dough still rising into the cold air. But the room upstairs is just a room now. The soldering irons are cold. The oscilloscopes are gone. The tangled wires and the dreams of radio waves have moved on. The young engineer, now an old man, walks down the street. He wears a heavy coat against the chill. He walks past the new glass buildings, past the university, past the coffee shops filled with students staring into their glowing rectangles. He does not look at them with bitterness. He looks at them with the calm understanding of someone who knows that everything is a cycle. He knows that he built the bridge they are walking on. He knows that the invisible waves carrying their videos and their messages are the same waves he studied in the silence of his youth. He puts his hand in his pocket. His fingers brush against a smooth, cold object. It is one of the old devices, a piece of black plastic with a worn-out keyboard. He keeps it not because it works. The battery has long since died, but because it is a worry stone. It is a reminder of the weight. He stops at a corner, waiting for the light to change. He pulls the device out for a moment. The screen is black, a dark mirror reflecting the gray sky. There is no red light blinking in the corner. The heart of the machine has stopped. He runs his thumb over the keys one last time. He feels the ridges, the tiny slopes, the perfect geometry that they had agonizingly designed. He remembers the click, that sharp, mechanical assertion of will. I am here. I am safe. I am working. The light changes. He slides the device back into his pocket. It settles there, a quiet, inert weight. The snow continues to fall, burying the sidewalks, burying the parking lots, softening the sharp angles of the city. It covers the history of the rise and the fall, leveling everything into a peaceful, white expanse. The empire has dissolved, not into dust, but into the atmosphere. It is in the way the world works now. It is in the expectation of the instant answer. It is in the pocket of every person on earth. The form has changed, the name has vanished, but the connection remains. The story does not end with a period, but with a fade. The visual field grows darker, the gray of the sky merging with the white of the ground. The hum of the city drops to a whisper. The servers power down. The fans stop spinning. And in the silence, there is rest. The long shift is over. The work is done. The thumb rests. The screen sleeps. And the snow keeps falling, silent and eternal, over the quiet town of Waterloo.